Now, the African Leadership Institute has written an open letter to leaders demanding that they include more young people in their governments. Africa boasts the youngest population globally, and yet many youth are either unemployed or marginalised. The average age of Africa's population is actually 19, with those over 65 accounting for just 3%. In 2018, the average age of African heads of state was 64.5 years old. Now, the African Leadership Institute says it's high time that this disproportional state of affairs is rectified. Dr. Jackie Chimhanzi is the CEO of that institute and joins us now for more on these stories. Dr. Chimhanzi, I mean, it's Africa's biggest opportunity and it's the biggest lost opportunity to the continent. The fact that we have the youngest population and so many of them lack opportunities.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Good morning to you and your viewers. It is a lost opportunity. I think so frequently we hear our leaders talk about Africa's demographic dividend. Africa is the youngest population, but young Africans are just disproportionately not represented at tables of decision making. Yeah. And we'd like to see that change. But also, yes.
No, go ahead, please.
But also, I mean, they themselves, the African Union member states, ratified and signed the Africa Youth Charter in 2006 in Banjul in the Gambia. We are now in 2021. It's been 15 years. So this open letter is a very polite reminder to say, can you please do what you yourselves set out to do?
And has there been any kind of step in the right direction since that charter, that youth charter, was signed?
There have been some steps, there has been progress, but the progress is slow, the progress is fragmented, you know what I mean? There isn't like a groundswell of evidence. Youth population continues to grow. So we're saying that we need to expedite these reforms and we need change sooner than later. So this open letter is actually a follow-up to a report that we wrote last year called The Greater Inclusion of African Youth in Public Service and Governance. What we do in that report, we look at African countries that have youth inclusion policies and we document those experiences, and we're saying to the rest of African heads of states, can you learn from your counterparts? So we've made it easy for you. Documented, all you need to do is replicate and copy and expedite process and progress.
Yeah, we do apologize to our viewers for the quality of our connection to Dr. Chimhanzi this morning. Dr. Chimhanzi, in terms of the countries on the African continent that are getting it right, who falls under that list?
There's a whole spectrum. So, for example, there's Rwanda. Rwanda, what they do, they've got youth internships into government, which is fantastic. We've got so many young people graduating every year from university sitting at home, right? So how about we start to mentor them, we bring them into government. If you're a student of agriculture, maybe you can intern at the Minister of Agriculture, right? If you did geology, you can go to the Minister of Mines, right? And when you get there, you shouldn't just be doing photocopying and making cups of teas like interns. You should be allowed real opportunities. You know, you should shadow the minister. You should help prepare papers for parliament. You know, you should get real experience. The minister should ask you, what are your ideas? You know, run competitions. Let young people start to bring new ideas of how we can improve productivity in some of our sectors. So there's Rwanda with the internship program. But more than the internship program, what President Kagame has done, he has mainstreamed youth. So they've got a youth mainstreaming policy. So it's very normal in Rwanda to see young ministers, young ambassadors, young CEOs of state-owned enterprises. Even on the boards of state-owned enterprises, it's young people. So in Rwanda, it's normal to see young people rather than them being the exception. And that's what we need to get towards, because young people are the majority.
You know, in our introduction to our discussion this morning with you, Dr. Chimhanzi, we also talked about the average age of a leader, a head of state in Africa being 64.5 years old. I mean, it's not unusual given the benchmarks around the world, but how much of that plays into the lack of the inclusion of young people getting a seat at the table?
It really does. I mean, so what our research also found is that there's a generation gap. And beyond the generation gap, there's also a governance gap as a result of the generation gap. So there's a huge gap between those who govern and those who are governed, right? And to minimize that gap, you need a great, a critical mass of young people in order to lower that gap, right? But it's also not just an age gap. I think it's a mindset, right? So when you look at somebody who's 19 and somebody who's 70, it's like a grandfather and a grandchild, right? So it's not just an age gap. It's a gap in terms of mindset, how to do things. And in 2021, we live in a technological age, right? So that gap begins to really manifest in the way that countries are governed. So we're saying we need more young people at the table with new ideas, fresh ideas, new solutions. We need to actually co-create solutions together.
I mean, what we've been doing on the continent, if we take a look back at, the past decades, we can see that in many countries on the continent, it's not been working. Second, third, fourth terms of presidents. Often the countries that are trying in terms of policies, the policies are there, but we're not seeing it translate. You talked about that African Youth Charter that was signed in 2006. The policies are there, and what it looks like on paper is great, but it's really not translating.
Yes. No, I completely agree. And I think there's a problem in Africa, over-planification. So many plans, and we just need the political will to start to implement. So with this report that we wrote, what we're saying is that you actually don't even have to go back to the drawing table. We've done the work for you. Here are the case studies. We can connect you with those countries. You just need to replicate, and something like a youth internship program. It's a quick win, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't cost much, but it just begins to let young people come into the system because they need to understand how governance works, right? And if they don't, we're going to have a sustainability problem. So right now we're talking about AU, the Agenda 2063. We're talking about the AfCFTA, right? But the current leaders who are drafting those agendas, they won't be here in 2063. That's the truth, right? So the sooner they start to let in a new generation into these institutions, the sooner young people can start to demystify these institutions, the sooner young people begin to understand how COMESA, SADC, ECOWAS work, the better for all of us. So we're talking about sort of an intentional and deliberate succession plan to start to develop a new pipeline of public servants.
Yeah, and it just makes sense. In terms of the African Leadership Institute and this letter, this open letter that's been written to African governments to, that they include young people, get young people a seat at the table. How open are governments to receiving this letter? In what spirit would you say it's been received?
Well, we'll find out today.
Yeah.
It will be launched today, and we'll do our best to also just push it to the various leaders. But it needs to be taken well, Young people mean well. I often hear people saying, older leaders will be threatened. Young leaders are not there to threaten them. We are there to work with them, to collaborate. It's a win-win. So you imagine if you're a head of state and you've got these amazing, young, brilliant economists running around writing policy papers, you look good, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So absolutely, they've got the energy, they've got the creativity, they've got the ideas, and they're in the technological age. They understand 2021. So we're trying to help. It's not a competition. It's not a threat. It's a win-win. We often talk about bringing women at the table, right? But we rarely ever talk about young people. And I think because of Africa's very unique demographic profile, that conversation needs to extend to also include young people. So around the table, we must have men, we must have women, we must have young people. And we must all co-create solutions to Africa's pressing problems.
Well, Dr. Chimhanzi, let me wish you well for the launch of that letter today. But before we let you go, I want to ask you how South Africa ranks in terms of that inclusion of young people, given that our own unemployment rate here in the country is well beyond, unofficially, the 40% mark, and most of that 40% is young people.
It's also been disappointing. Every time there's cabinet reshuffles, we just see the same people being recycled, and that's disappointing. So we also want heads of states to take a bet and find a new young person. In the same way Trevor Manuel was about 30 and Tito Mboweni, when Madiba was president, right? So somebody took a chance on them, right? And we need current leaders to do the same. Pick some young star, 30-year-old, bring them in, groom them, teach them. Because nobody was born a minister, nobody was born a president, nobody was born a chairman, right? But somebody has to take a bet on you, and we're asking leaders to take a bet on young people. So I also hear this thing about they don't have experience. Nobody was born with experience.
Yeah.
Well,
that's some great perspective there. Dr. Jackie Chimhanzi, thanks so much for your time this morning, this important discussion. She is CEO of the African Leadership Institute, writing an open letter to leaders on the African continent for more young people to be included specifically in their governments. Thanks very much for your time this